In the grand calculus of cosmic disasters, planetary flooding ranked somewhere between mild inconvenience and moderately embarrassing extinction event for most spacefaring civilizations. The typical response involved emergency broadcasts, orbital evacuation protocols, and perhaps a strongly worded complaint to whatever geological processes had caused the mess. What it did not typically involve was sitting on rocks, collecting seashells, and banging stones together like some sort of deranged percussion ensemble. But humans, as the galaxy would learn, had never been particularly concerned with what was typical. The Vrexian Astronomical Survey had been monitoring Earth for approximately 3 standard cycles, primarily because it occupied a statistical sweet spot in the habitable zone, and secondarily because watching pre-spaceflight civilizations stumble through technological adolescence made for excellent educational holodramas. The planet harbored a bipedal species that had recently discovered fire, which was charming in the way that watching children play with building blocks was charming. You knew they would eventually create something interesting or burn down the metaphorical house. Then the oceans decided to have an opinion about continental arrangement. It happened over the course of a single planetary rotation. Seismic events, atmospheric pressure systems, and what could only be described as cosmically poor timing converged into a watery apocalypse that would have made any disaster preparedness committee weep into their emergency rations. The seas rose. They rose with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for hostile takeovers and surprise military coups. Coastal settlements vanished. River valleys transformed into inland seas. Mountain ranges became archipelagos. Everything that humanity had built over countless generations, every shelter, every hunting ground, every carefully maintained fire pit, disappeared beneath waves that showed all the mercy of an accountant reviewing expense reports. The Vrexian survey team, positioned in comfortable orbit aboard the research vessel Contemplative Measurements, watched with the detached fascination of scientists observing a petri dish culture collapse. Lead researcher Vex Tharion initiated standard extinction documentation protocols. Junior analyst Quinn Metra began drafting the official report. It was all very routine, very professional, and very much resigned to the fact that they were watching an entire species circle the evolutionary drain. Projected survival rate, Vex Tharion inquired, manipulating holographic data streams with practiced efficiency. 0.03%, Quinn Metra responded, antennae drooping with appropriate solemnity. And that is being generous. The species lacks aquatic adaptation, shows no evidence of advanced construction capability, and had not yet developed metallurgy. Current atmospheric conditions suggest the flooding will persist for at least 200 rotation cycles. Water coverage has reached 87% of previously habitable land mass. Mark them as transitioning to extinct status. File the preliminary reports. Such a waste. They were just getting interesting with the whole fire situation. Vex Tharion made a notation in the digital record, the Vrexian equivalent of signing a death certificate. Add a footnote about the unfortunate timing. They had shown promising cognitive development. Should we initiate humanitarian intervention protocols? Quinn Metra asked, though the question was perfunctory. Both researchers knew the answer. They are pre-contact. Regulations are explicit. We observe, we document, we do not interfere. Vex Tharion's translator rendered the words with appropriate bureaucratic finality. Besides, intervention at this stage would be futile. They have no infrastructure to support relief efforts, no technology compatible with our aid systems, and insufficient population density to justify resource allocation. In other words, they were doomed, and helping them would be expensive, complicated, and ultimately pointless. But here is where the story should have ended, where the cosmic record should have inscribed another footnote about a promising species that encountered bad luck and worse timing. Here is where humanity should have gracefully exited the evolutionary stage, leaving behind nothing but waterlogged caves and the faint echo of what might have been. Humans, however, had apparently not read that particular script. The survivors numbered in the hundreds, scattered across rocky outcrops that thrust above the new sea level like the knuckles of a drowning giant. One such group, consisting of 47 individuals, clung to a granite shelf that had previously been a mountain peak and was now beachfront property of the most undesirable sort. They had no tools except what they carried, which amounted to a few stone hand axes and some half-burnt sticks from fires that the flood had thoroughly extinguished. No food except what the water might provide, and the water was currently providing mostly salt, debris, and the occasional confused fish. No shelter except what they could imagine into existence, and imagination was a poor substitute for actual walls when the wind picked up. The situation was, by any objective measure, hopeless. The humans looked at this hopeless situation and apparently decided that hopeless was simply a starting point. The Vrexian survey team, still documenting the extinction process with scientific thoroughness, zoomed optical sensors onto this particular group because they exhibited unusual thermal signatures, meaning they were still alive, still moving, and still doing something that registered as purposeful activity rather than the random spasms of approaching death. "They are gathering debris," Quinn-Metra observed, adjusting sensor resolution. "Wooden fragments from destroyed vegetation primarily, also collecting vine material and what appears to be, are they gathering mud? Standard death delay behavior," Vextharian noted, making annotations. "Many species attempt shelter construction in the final stages. Psychological comfort mechanism. It will fail, naturally. They lack binding materials, architectural knowledge, and frankly the time required to develop either. The structures will collapse within one rotation, two at most." Except the humans were not attempting to build shelter so much as they were actually building shelter. The distinction seemed minor but turned out to be catastrophically significant. They wedged branches into rock crevices, creating a basic framework. They wove smaller pieces through the gaps, forming walls that were more suggestion than substance. They plastered the whole affair with mud scraped from tidal pools, mixing it with dried grass to create a primitive concrete. The structures looked like they had been designed by committee, built by enthusiasts, and approved by no one with actual engineering credentials. They also worked. Impossible, Vextharian stated, which in scientific circles is the polite way of saying reality had just violated several fundamental assumptions. Those structures should not provide meaningful protection. The materials are unsuitable, the design is aerodynamically unsound, and basic structural analysis suggests they should collapse under their own weight. Look at that angle. It defies basic load distribution principles. And yet, Quinn-Metra replied, gesturing at the holographic display where humans were quite rudely remaining not dead inside their impossible huts. They persist in not collapsing. How inconsiderate of them. The structures are maintaining integrity through a storm system that should have reduced them to component materials. Perhaps they are simply lucky. One storm is insufficient data. Vextharian adjusted the monitoring parameters, extending observation duration. We will continue documentation. Their structures will fail. Mathematics demands it. But mathematics, as it turned out, had not consulted with human stubbornness before making demands. 3 rotation cycles passed. The huts remained standing. 5 cycles. The huts not only stood but showed signs of improvement. Humans were adding second layers, creating drainage systems, and reinforcing weak points identified through the scientific method of it leaked there during the last storm. 10 cycles. The huts had become actual shelters, weatherproof structures that kept inhabitants dry, warm and insufficiently dead. The Vrexian researchers watched this development with the growing unease of individuals who had just realized their fundamental assumptions about reality might require revision. But the huts were merely the opening act in what would become a festival of improbable survival. The humans, having successfully confused physics into allowing their shelters to exist, turned their attention to the problem of food. The ocean that had destroyed their world now surrounded them with staggering abundance, as if apologizing for the inconvenience by providing a buffet. Fish, shellfish, seaweed, crustaceans, an entire ecosystem pressed against their rocky refuge, free for the taking. The humans stared at this buffet with the expression of individuals who had just realized they had no plates, no utensils, and no idea how to access food that lived underwater, and had opinions about being caught. Then one of them picked up a shell. Not for eating, which would have been reasonable. Not for decoration, which would have been premature. But for cutting. The human examined the shell's edge, tested it against plant fibers, discovered it created separation where separation had not previously existed, and promptly began manufacturing cordage. Other humans observed this development with interest. They collected their own shells, selected ones with the sharpest natural edges, and began producing their own cutting implements. Within 2 solar rotations, the group had produced fishing lines from twisted plant fibers and animal sinew. Within 4, they had nets woven in patterns that suggested someone had figured out the mathematical principles of mesh construction without benefit of mathematics. Within 6, they were pulling aquatic life from the sea with the systematic efficiency of individuals who had decided drowning was optional and starvation was simply poor planning. The Vrexian survey team stopped writing the Extinction report and started writing something else entirely. "They are making tools," Quinn Metra said, and the statement hung in the observation deck like an accusation. From shells, from rocks, from materials that barely qualify as materials, that human there is using a shell to cut through fish bone. That should not be possible, given the relative hardness differentials. Tool use is not unprecedented in pre-industrial species, Vextharian countered, though the argument sounded weak even to Vrexian auditory organs. Many organisms utilize found objects for specific tasks. Certain avian species use sticks to extract insects. Some aquatic mammals employ rocks to crack shells. Yes, but those organisms did not just survive planetary catastrophe and then decide to invent fishing while homeless and standing on a rock. Quinn Metra gestured emphatically at the display. Those organisms are utilizing instinctual behaviors refined over millions of evolutionary cycles. These humans are improvising. They are problem-solving in real time. That one just figured out how to create a barbed fishing hook from a curved shell fragment. Nobody taught them that. They simply decided it should exist and made it exist. The humans, blissfully unaware they were violating expected behavioral patterns, continued their campaign of aggressive survival. They collected specific types of stones, testing them with the methodical patience of individuals who had nothing but time and everything to prove. Flint, chert, obsidian, volcanic glass that fractured in predictable patterns when struck correctly. They experimented with striking angles, learning which impacts produced useful flakes and which produced disappointing shrapnel. "This is absurd," Vextharion declared, watching a human fashion a cutting tool through nothing more than applied percussive violence and what could only be described as weaponized stubbornness. "They are creating edged implements through hitting rocks together. This is not advanced problem solving. This is barely organized frustration. Any species with opposable digits could accomplish the same given sufficient motivation. Then why, Quinn-Metra asked quietly, do our databases contain no other records of post-catastrophe tool development at this speed? The Keltherin took 3 generations to redevelop basic implements after their volcanic winter. The portion required outside intervention to recover technological capability following their plague years. These humans went from drowning to manufacturing in less than 20 rotation cycles. Vextherion had no answer that satisfied scientific rigor or personal comfort. The humans continued their impossible progress. They struck stones together, producing sharp flakes with edges that could cut, scrape, and pierce. Then they struck those flakes in specific ways, producing sharper flakes with more refined edges. Then they attached those sharper flakes to wooden handles using plant fiber cordage and created compound implements that looked suspiciously like knives, scrapers, and spear points, proper tools with multiple components serving integrated functions. Organized frustration that produces functional tools, Quinn-Metra corrected, highlighting analysis data. Their implements show evidence of planning. They select specific stone types based on fracture properties. They employ consistent striking techniques that maximize useful flake production while minimizing waste. They modify designs based on performance feedback. They are iterating, researcher. They are learning at a rate that should not be possible for a species at this developmental stage. And that was the detail that transformed this from interesting observation into concerning implication. The humans were not merely surviving through luck or instinct. They were thinking, adapting, and improving their situation through deliberate experimentation. One group discovered that heating certain stones made them easier to shape, changing their fracture properties in useful ways. Another group learned which plant fibers produced the strongest cordage by testing different specimens until patterns emerged. A third group developed a method for waterproofing their huts, using rendered animal fat and woven reeds, creating structures that could withstand the increasingly violent storm systems. Then they started sharing information. The Vrexian team observed with growing alarm as groups separated by vast distances of open water developed similar solutions to common problems. Except they were not completely similar. Each group added innovations, improvements, creative variations on the basic theme of refuse to die, despite overwhelming evidence suggesting death was the sensible option. Humans on the eastern archipelago developed superior fishing hooks with barbs positioned at optimal angles for catch retention. Humans on the western rocks created better cutting tools using a specialized striking technique that produced thinner, sharper flakes. Humans on the southern islands discovered that certain shells could be ground into hooks rather than chipped, opening new design possibilities. And somehow, impossibly, these innovations propagated between groups. They are communicating across water barriers, Quinn-Metra reported, adjusting long-range sensors to track crude watercraft constructed from bundled reeds and hope. Traveling between settlement sites, exchanging resources and apparently knowledge. That vessel there, it should not float. The buoyancy calculations are borderline impossible given the material density and construction method. Yet it is carrying 3 individuals and a cargo of fish across open water. That requires abstract thinking, symbolic reasoning, and social cooperation sophisticated enough to value information transfer over immediate personal survival needs. Vextherion said slowly, the implications crystallizing into something approaching dread. These are not primitive survival behaviors, these are foundational elements of civilization. They are building cultural exchange networks while still figuring out basic shelter. The researcher pulled up comparative data from the Vrexian archives, scrolling through thousands of documented extinction events across hundreds of worlds. Species after species, civilization after civilization, each responding to catastrophic disaster in predictable patterns. When the Keltharan homeworld flooded, they retreated to high-altitude settlements and waited for rescue from their orbital colonies. When the Portian oceans rose, they migrated to polar regions and hoped for environmental recovery. When the Thecs faced similar catastrophe, they essentially gave up and waited for the end with stoic dignity, having decided the universe was clearly finished with them. None of them built huts from sticks and developed Stone Age technology from scratch while standing on rocks surrounded by hostile ocean. Quinn Metra finished. None of them looked at apocalyptic disaster and decided the appropriate response was arts and crafts. None of them went from homeless to trading network in under 50 rotations, but that was precisely what humans had done, and they showed no signs of stopping. The shelters evolved from crude lean-tos into sophisticated structures with multiple rooms, water drainage systems, and smoke ventilation for cooking fires that humans had somehow convinced wet driftwood to sustain. The tools progressed from sharp rocks to compound implements with multiple components serving specialized functions, knives with wrapped handles for better grip, spears with balanced weight distribution for accurate throwing, scrapers with carefully shaped edges for processing hides. Fishing techniques advanced from simple lines to complex trap systems that caught aquatic life while humans slept. Passive collection methods that showed genuine understanding of fish behavior patterns and tidal movements. Some enterprising individual figured out how to weave underwater fences that funneled fish into collection areas. Another discovered that certain plant extracts, when released into tidal pools, stunned fish without harming their edibility. Slept, notably, in their dry huts on their reed beds under their woven blankets while surrounded by an ocean that had tried very hard to kill them and had instead become their larder, their highway, and their building supply store. "We need to file a revised report," Vextharian said eventually, manipulating holographic interfaces to delete the extinction documentation with the reluctant air of someone admitting a significant professional error. "This species is not transitioning to extinct status. They are transitioning to something else entirely." "What classification?" Quinn Metra asked. The researcher paused, antenna twitching with uncertainty that was highly unusual for senior Vrexian scientists. "Concerning, file them under deeply concerning, and flag the report for Interspecies Development Council review. They are going to want to know about this." The revised report propagated through Vrexian scientific channels with the speed of information that was simultaneously fascinating and vaguely threatening. Other research teams contributed observations from their own monitoring stations positioned around the planet. The humans were not limited to a single success story. Across the globe, wherever survivors had found themselves stranded on rocks in the new ocean world, similar patterns emerged. Tools, shelters, fishing, cooperation, innovation. The response was not localized luck, it was species-wide behavior. The humans had been dealt a catastrophic hand by planetary circumstance and responded by inventing civilization from available materials. The Interspecies Development Council, a bureaucratic organization dedicated to monitoring pre-spaceflight species and ensuring they did not accidentally blow themselves up or intentionally blow up anyone else, convened an emergency session specifically to discuss Earth. Council meetings typically addressed mundane matters like trade route disputes and colonization permits. Emergency sessions were reserved for actual emergencies, hostile first contacts, technological disasters, existential threats to established civilizations. A pre-spaceflight species making tools from rocks did not typically qualify as emergency material. "Explain to me," The Theldrosian representative demanded bioluminescent patterns flickering with agitation in colors that translated roughly to deeply confused and slightly angry. How a species without metallurgy survived complete habitat destruction and is now thriving. Our own ancestors barely survived our ice age with established technology and continental refuges. These humans had nothing. They made tools from stones, the Vrexian delegate reported, displaying holographic documentation of human tool-making processes. That is a description of behavior exhibited by particularly clever scavenger animals. Yes, but these particular clever scavenger animals also invented fishing nets, architectural principles, and intergroup trade networks while homeless and surrounded by water. They are now expanding their settlements, developing agriculture on reclaimed tidal land, and showing early signs of maritime culture. They have progressed from survival to cultural development in less than 200 local rotations. The council chamber filled with the multilingual equivalent of stunned silence. Species that had taken millennia to develop basic technology in comfortable, stable environments struggled to comprehend how humans had essentially speedrun early civilization while actively drowning. "Show me the timeline again," the Quilchian observer requested, compound eyes focusing on data streams. From catastrophe to agriculture, the progression seems accelerated. The holographic display reorganized, showing human development in compressed chronological format. Flood, survival, shelter, tools, fishing, trade, agriculture. Each stage bleeding into the next, with barely time for catastrophe processing therapy sessions in between. "That is not normal developmental pacing," someone stated from the back of the chamber. "No," the Vrexian delegate agreed. "It is not. Under normal circumstances, we would expect centuries between these developmental stages. Humans compressed the timeline through what we can only describe as aggressive adaptation. They did not wait for conditions to improve. They improved conditions. What happens when the waters recede?" A quiet voice asked from the Peltharian section. That was the question that transformed concern into something approaching fear. The humans had developed survival technology and cooperative social structures under the absolute worst conditions imaginable. They had learned to thrive with nothing but rocks, sticks, and apparently limitless capacity for spite directed at an uncaring universe. What would they become when given actual resources, stable land, and time to develop without existential catastrophe breathing down their necks? What did you get when you took a species that responded to apocalypse by inventing civilization and then gave them favorable conditions? The council did not have comfortable answers. The Vrexian survey team continued monitoring Earth, though their mission parameters had shifted from documentation to something more like surveillance. The human population stabilized, then grew. Settlements expanded from rocky outcrops to reclaimed coastlines as waters gradually retreated over decades. The stone tools became more sophisticated, specialized implements for specific tasks, showing genuine understanding of material properties and functional efficiency. The huts evolved into permanent structures with stone foundations, wooden frameworks, and thatched roofs that could withstand seasonal storms. The fishing communities developed into coastal societies with distinct cultural identities, all sharing common origin stories about the time the sea tried to kill everyone, and everyone responded by making the sea regret its life choices. "They are creating art," Quinn Metra observed one day, highlighting cave paintings discovered on the holographic display. Depicting the flood, their survival, their tools, they are encoding their knowledge in permanent visual formats. teaching methods for tool creation, fishing techniques, shelter construction, all preserved in painted form. Of course they are. Vextharion replied with the weary tone of a researcher who had long since stopped being surprised by human behavior. Why would they simply remember how to survive catastrophe when they could paint detailed instructions for future generations? That would be far too reasonable. Next you will tell me they are developing symbolic writing systems. Actually, Quinn Metra manipulated the display, highlighting marks on preserved shells. Early evidence suggests they are using notched patterns to track lunar cycles and tidal patterns. It may be proto-writing. The senior researcher made a sound that the translator rendered as tired resignation. Naturally, why merely survive when you can invent record-keeping? The younger analyst tilted sensory organs in what might have been amusement. You have developed an attachment to them, researcher. I have developed a healthy respect for a species that looked at extinction and said no thank you, I think I will invent tools instead. There is a difference. Vextharion paused, though I confess a certain admiration. They had every reason to surrender, every logical justification for accepting defeat. Instead they collected shells and got to work. But it was not just respect or admiration, and both of them knew it. It was recognition that they had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic records. Most species developed civilization gradually, building on stable foundations with room for error and time for correction. Humans had developed civilization spite first, trauma bonded by shared catastrophe, and united by the fundamental realization that the universe was not going to save them, so they had better save themselves. The stone tools they made were not elegant. The huts they built were not architecturally sophisticated. The shells they collected were not particularly impressive as raw materials. But together these elements represented something profound, the absolute refusal to accept circumstance as destiny. The humans had been given nothing, and decided that nothing was simply their starting point. Cycles passed. The Vrexian survey team rotated personnel, but monitoring Earth remained a priority posting. Junior researchers who wanted to study that planet where the species survived impossible flooding through crafting competed for positions aboard contemplative measurements. Academic papers analyzing human survival strategies proliferated through xenoanthropology departments, spawning entire subfields dedicated to catastrophe adaptation and emergency technology development. The humans themselves, blissfully unaware they had become the galaxy's favorite underdog story, continued building their societies on foundations of reclaimed land and remembered trauma. They developed pottery, fired in kilns that showed sophisticated understanding of temperature control. They domesticated plants that had survived the flood, creating agriculture adapted to the new coastlines. They built boats that could survive deep water, expanding their territory and trade networks. They created religious systems that honored the sea as both destroyer and provider, showing philosophical sophistication that suggested they were processing their collective trauma through cultural frameworks. Eventually, inevitably, they would develop more advanced technology. They would discover metallurgy, develop writing systems beyond their proto-scripts, create complex governments and trading networks that spanned continents. They would build ships that could cross oceans and eventually ships that could cross space. And when they finally reached the stars and encountered the species that had been watching their entire improbable journey, they would ask the obvious question, why did you never help? The Vrexian response was already being drafted, refined through multiple committees and diplomatic channels. It would explain the non-interference protocols, the importance of allowing species to develop naturally, the countless regulations preventing advanced civilizations from meddling in pre-spaceflight cultures. It would be professional, courteous, and thoroughly reasonable. It would also be a complete lie. The truth which no official report would ever state, but which every researcher who had watched humans survive the flood understood, was simpler and more unsettling. They had not helped because they had been too busy taking notes on what helping oneself looked like when executed with sufficient determination and available rocks. Because somewhere in the process of watching humans refuse to die, the galaxy had learned something uncomfortable about itself. Most species, when faced with extinction-level catastrophe, looked to the stars for salvation. They hoped for rescue, prayed for intervention, waited for someone with better technology and more resources to solve their problems. Humans had looked at the stars, shrugged, and picked up rocks. And that fundamental difference, that bone-deep conviction that survival was a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be granted, made them dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with weapons or warfare. It made them survivors, adapters, the kind of species that would face any challenge, any setback, any cosmic disaster with the same basic approach: assess available resources and get to work. The galaxy was full of species that had overcome challenges, had developed technology, had reached the stars through intelligence and cooperation. But the galaxy had been notably lacking in species that had looked at planetary catastrophe and responded by organizing a group craft session. Until humans, who had taken everything the universe threw at them and thrown it right back, equipped with nothing but stone tools, reed huts, and the kind of stubbornness that made cosmic forces reconsider their life choices. The sea had taken everything: their homes, their possessions, their established territories, their carefully maintained fires that had burned for generations. It had reduced humanity to scattered refugees clinging to rocks, stripped of every advantage except the ones they carried in their minds. The humans had looked at this complete devastation, this absolute reset of their civilization, and responded with what would become their species' motto, though they did not know it yet. Well, this is inconvenient. Then they collected some shells, found some rocks, and got to work. And somehow, impossibly, that had been enough.